And thanks for inviting me to talk a little bit today. And our theme today is fire refugia. And this is a shot from the Cerro Grande burn that probably some of you are familiar with. This is a landscape where I grew up in northern New Mexico, so it's near and dear to my heart. And yeah, what we're looking at is what we're calling a fire refugium. So let's see here if I can't change my slides. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge our group that we've been working with, the Fire Refugia team. This presentation will be based on several studies that we've published really recently, or mostly over the last year. And I just want to acknowledge Carol Miller, Meg Krawchuk, Sandra Hare, Mark Parisien, Geneva Chong, Tim Delory, Will Downing, Ryan Walker, Garrett Meigs, and Ellen Whitman, who've all been instrumental to this study and quite a lot of other stuff that we've been working on associated with this topic over the last really several years, almost maybe seven or so years that we've been interested in these questions. So, okay, so here's how the presentation will roll. I'll talk about the fire refugium concept, which probably some of you have heard of, and hopefully it's not super new. And then some of our recent questions we've been exploring within burn perimeters. How much forest actually persists is something we could maybe call a fire refugium. How well do these patches of surviving forest support landscape resilience via forest recovery, the potential to serve as seed sources? And then how might we employ the refugium concept in forest management? And certainly hope to have some questions from you guys there. And just to sort of jump to the take-home message here, if we look at these patches of trees, this is from within the Las Conchas fire perimeter, also in the Jemez Mountains. I'll just in case you're gonna check out of the presentation early, here's the take-home message. I'm gonna try and make the case that these trees are the most important trees left on the landscape. Well, they're the only trees left on this landscape, but they're the most important trees anywhere out there. So they've become quite important. Okay, I probably don't need to spend much time convincing this group that we're seeing some pretty dramatic changes over the last several decades in terms of how fires burn, how much area burns, how much fire activity there is, the conditions that fires are burning under, and the post-fire conditions that may determine whether or not forests are able to recover. So we know that sort of as a consequence of land use legacies, fire suppression, maybe grazing, prior to fire suppression that sort of shut down, that removed fine fuels and shut down some of the frequent fires that occurred before active fire suppression. And then warming and often drying conditions are increasing our rate of forest loss. So we can think about sort of resistance mechanisms and resistance to fire being lost, and then decreasing the rate of forest recovery. And so that's another way to conceptualize that is resilience. And you put those two things together, and there's a lot of concerns about whether or not we're gonna have forests in some of these areas in the future. So just to kind of belabor that point a little bit, we could imagine sort of how forests might, theoretically respond to a disturbance. And, if we had a fire occurring at a certain time, we might imagine sort of that lower green line. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, representing what we think was the case in a lot of these southwestern ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests, where they had sort of inherent resistance to fire with, tree spacing and some of their adaptations, thick bark, et cetera. And really maybe we had a lot of fire with very little change in these forests, but some of those resistance mechanisms have been overcome with fuel loading and also with fires burning under extreme conditions. And so systems change, and that's represented by these other lines. When systems change dramatically following fire, what are the potential outcomes? Well, in one scenario, we have resilience. So maybe the forest returns over some relatively, relatively short time frame, maybe over, we start to see tree seedlings within the first few years after fire, and forest recovery trajectory, within several decades to 100 years, perhaps following fire. But then we also have some other scenarios where we have major change and we have those resilience mechanisms overcome, maybe leading to ultimately some sort of persistent transformation to an alternate state, or perhaps just super delayed recovery that might require thousands and thousands of years, in which case I think we could say the system has been, for all intents and purposes, converted or type converted, and we're stuck with a non-forest system for a substantial amount of time, or sort of an alternate state. So the questions that we're interested in are where we don't want to see conversion, how can we best promote mechanisms that allow forests to be resistant and or resilient to disturbances, to changing climate, or at least not get in the way or obstruct these mechanisms. Okay, so some terminology for you. Refugia were sort of an ecological sphere defined as habitats that components of biodiversity retreats to, persists in, and can potentially expand from under changing environmental conditions. We've taken that term and applied it to fire and other disturbances, and fire refugia is defined in Ari and Beden's paper, are landscape elements that remain unburned or minimally affected by fire, thus supporting post-fire ecosystem function, biodiversity, and resilience to disturbances. And I'll be honest with you, it took me a little while to sort of come around to this concept of fire refugia. I tend to look at burns as these matrices of complex sort of gradients of fire effects, from patches where maybe there was very little effect or no effect, to high severity patches where the landscape is really dramatically altered. And so I think the refugium concept is sort of a lens, and I have come around to it to the point that now I'm sort of proselytizing it to you guys. But it's a lens through which we can look at landscapes, and that allows us to maybe see components of landscapes in more focus. But of course, we're also choosing to not focus on other components. So I think it's a lens that is really actually a pretty useful way of looking at landscapes. Okay, we could think about refugia as sort of we could maybe break that down to two different categories. Persistent refugia, areas where maybe there are some sort of permanent topographic features that serve as fire breaks, and we would expect forests or whatever the vegetation is to persist through multiple fires. So these might be areas where we really don't see much fire, or fire can sort of areas in the landscape that might change fire behavior, and over multiple disturbances, these refugia would persist. Or we could think about sort of on the other hand, transient refugia, which might be the product of those same factors, or it's just sort of random stochastic fire behavior. Why did this patch of trees persist and this patch get torched? Who knows? Maybe wind changed at that moment when the fire was rolling through. Or maybe vegetation history. Maybe there was a previous burn or something else that created a natural fuel break. But that would still be transient, that we wouldn't expect to always necessarily be there. And these types of refugia might only serve for a single disturbance. So maybe it's just a patch of trees that persist, that made it through one fire, and the next fire it's gone. But in the meantime, they still had an important ecological function. Our definition for this presentation, sort of just to operationalize a definition that works for us to think about refugia for forests, are surviving forest patches within burn perimeters. All right, trying to change the slide. Okay, so briefly, our methods are we've been sampling burns in the Northwest and Southwest US. We actually have 13 burns, lucky 13. The 13th one's not included on this map up in Idaho. These burns occurred in ponderosa pine and dry mixed-conifer forest types between 2000 and 2005. Most of them were in 2000 or 2002, and then we sampled most of them in 2017. So in theory, there had been enough time to see whether or not recovery or forest tree regeneration was proceeding, or if it appeared that it wasn't. And for each of these burns, we developed high-resolution maps of surviving tree refugia, and I'll talk about that shortly. Then we went out and sampled sites stratified across gradients of proximity and density of these patches of trees, distances to seed sources, sampled 686 sites, and counted tree seedlings, measured vegetation, and measured a whole bunch of other stuff. But mostly today, I'll just be talking about the tree seedlings. And then just to sort of remind us, our two questions that we're interested in with these particular studies were how much forest persists and how well the refugia support resilience via forest recovery. Okay, so many of you are probably familiar with monitoring trends in burn severity and these Landsat-based maps of burn severity classes. This is sort of the standard approach to looking at landscapes following fire. Just as an example, here's the pumpkin fire in Arizona that some of you may know. And the DNBR, continuously varying reflectance index of DNBR is then sort of converted into these MTVS burn severity classes, unburned to low, low, moderate, and high. And so you can look and see on the right side of the slide that in this pumpkin fire, 29% was unburned low, 33% low, 16% moderate, and 22% high. So these are great maps. They're easily accessible. They're fairly standardized in terms of how they're produced. They're produced abundantly for all sort of fires over 400 and some acres in the western U.S. And they're pretty good product. But if you really start to dig in, there are some issues with it, as with anything. There are trade-offs, and the con of these maps is that they're fairly low resolution, 30 meters, and the classes are a little bit subjective at times, and they can be really sort of hard to interpret. Like, what is the difference between that 16% moderate and that 22% high? Are there trees on it from a purely forest-centric point of view? Do we expect to find trees? Are those areas that would all be treeless or not? Right? We don't really know. So we went in and for these studies, developed some really high resolution maps using Postfire NAPE 1 meter resolution imagery and this semi-automated object-based classification. I don't want to get into these methods too much, but the idea is that we can use this great 4-band NAPE imagery to come up with 1 meter resolution maps of the question that we were interested in, which is how many trees are left in these burns. And then we took our maps that we made and subjected them to an imagery-based accuracy assessment, as well as field-based accuracy assessment from our 686 points that we were sampling in the field. So here's what we came up with for our maps. Here's that pumpkin fire again. And you can see for this particular burn, 49% of the burn was categorized as non-forested, 51% was forest. So pro is it's high resolution and for our purposes easily interpretable. The downside of these maps are it's pretty labor intensive, and it's pretty unlikely that we'll all be starting to use NAPE-based maps of burn severity anytime soon. But maybe as we acquire more high resolution satellite imagery, we can move towards something like this. Okay, so just to sort of start in on some of the findings of our mapping effort, most burns contained a fairly substantial proportion of surviving forest. These were all burns that were generally large, and we knew there was a large component of high severity fire in these burns, but they varied from about 20% to 57% of surviving forest. The Hayman fire in Colorado was our sort of most severely impacted burn, with only 20% of that burn contained sort of maintaining surviving forest. And then the poplar burn on the north rim of the Grand Canyon had 57% forest, and everything else sort of fell in between those two. And just to point out that our accuracy assessment suggested these maps were really, really accurate. So on average, about 94, 95% depending on the imagery-based or field-based accuracy assessments that we conducted. Okay, so we just to maybe explain what this slide shows. Basically, what we did is we took all the pixels from our images, from our maps, and then we looked at where they were distributed in relation to those MTBS severity classes. So this is I'm looking at the upper left portion of the slide, the Hayman burn here. Of all those pixels, how many fell in the unburned to low category? That's the UL on the far left, the low, the moderate, or high severity. And I should have mentioned this before, but the green is representing forest, and that sort of brown color represents non-forested. So Hayman, remember, was about 20% forested. How much of that forest was in the unburned or low portion of that fire, the low or the moderate or the high? And what I really want to focus in on here is that there's actually forest all throughout that high severity area. So just because something was classified by MTBS as high severity doesn't mean there's no trees out there. And basically what we can say based on these figures here is even these high severity patches contain some forested pixels, and probably we're missing those at the 30-meter scale just because some of these patches are really small, and I'll get into that in a second. Okay, but what you can see sort of across all of these burns, if you're looking at the right side of the slide, you can see that, hey, there's a lot more forest where it says unburned, low, low, or moderate, and there's a lot less forest at the high severity portions of these burns, that's consistent with what we would expect. But there is some forest left out there. And just to also point out, these figures are from Ryan Walker's paper that was published, I think maybe last month. So, and I'll have all the full sort of citations for stuff at the end of the presentation if you're still hanging on by then. Okay, so another sort of summary of what we learned. So the figure on the left shows patch size as a function of these different burn severity classes. And you can see that on average, patches are pretty small. Our median patch size was 0.01 acres or 56 square meters. So that's most of our patches of these refugia are actually really small. And if you look at those two graphs on the left, you'll see that based on these two different burn severity ways of categorizing burn severity, DNBR and RDBR, the same pattern emerges that the patches are smaller within the higher severity classes, which is also what we would expect. But the sort of take-home message, if you put this slide together with the last one, is that there's actually quite a lot of small refugia out there on the landscape. So even within the high severity patches, there's still trees out there scattered around in little clumps. Okay. And then if you look at the right side of the slide here, this is showing distance to the nearest live tree as a function of MTBS or an RDNBR threshold-based burn severity classification. We can say that the distance from any given non-forest point to the nearest live tree seed source increases with the Landsat-derived burn severity. So maybe ranging from within these lower classes, any point might be within 10 meters of a live tree up to sort of on the higher end, maybe 100 or thereabout meters in these high severity patches, which is also consistent with what we would expect, but we're just sort of trying to quantify that a little bit more. Okay, and then one other sort of results slide of these mapping methods. We also looked at RDNBR. For some reason I'm stumbling on that one right now. It's about 8:30 here in Spain, and so that's my excuse. Anyways, it's the end of a long day. Okay, and NBR, Postfire, NBR. So we wanted to see if we could find like thresholds of these Landsat-based metrics that might be useful for saying whether or not something is forest. And we also looked at DNBR and Postfire, SWIR. These are sort of the components of RDNBR and DNBR. Anyways, basically, we found that you could use thresholds of these two Landsat-based metrics to say whether or not something was forest, but their accuracy was generally kind of low, 77% or thereabouts. So might still be useful to be aware that we can probably classify maps as forest or not based on those Landsat-based reflectance metrics. Okay, so now moving on to predicting regeneration. So remember, we went and measured these 686 sites, and the question was, how well do refugia predict whether or not you have tree seedlings on the ground at any given point? And so, you know, one thing we probably know is that the abundance of seedlings should decrease as you go farther away from seed sources. So one metric that we looked at was just simple distance to nearest seed source. Does distance to a patch of surviving trees predict whether or not there are seedlings at the site, or the number of seedlings at a site? And also just kind of bearing in mind our focus here, ponderosa pine, mixed conifer forest types. We'll talk a little bit about aspen later on. But we also know seed rate is expected to decrease exponentially from the seed source, because seeds disperse in two distance. So maybe distance squared could be another metric of regeneration. But also some sites are near bigger patches. Some sites are near smaller patches. So not all patches are the same. And some sites are near multiple patches. So if you look at the graphic on the lower left, it's just sort of an example of a point the point that might be near, you know, 3 seed sources versus a point that's near 1 seed source. We wouldn't expect necessarily those points to end up with the same number of tree seedlings. So that gives rise to these slightly more complicated metrics that we developed that we're calling distance weighted density and distance squared weighted density. But what these did were basically using these high resolution refugia maps, accounting for the potential for, you know, seeds to arrive at any given point from multiple sites, and then weighting those sites by how far away they are from that focal point that we're interested in. So, you know, if you imagine that little black dot fell entirely within a green square there, that would be our highest value. If it was entirely within sort of an unforested area, that'd be our lowest value. And then intermediate values would be based on both how much green was in that square, as well as whether the green was near or far from that focal cell. So those are our 2 different metrics that we thought might be better at predicting whether or not you have tree seedlings at any given site. Okay, and then just to show you some excruciatingly detailed table of numbers here, but just to, you don't really have to look at that. Just to sort of explain what it shows is that basically both distance and this more complicated distance squared weighted density metric were really good predictors of tree seedling abundance at any given site for different assemblages of species that we were interested in. So ponderosa pine is pipo. We have an obligate-seeding mixed conifer assemblage that's mostly Doug fir, but also includes some of the true firs when they were around. And then resprouting and serotinous species, which basically our model for those suggests, well, neither of these metrics, distance or distance squared weighted density, were particularly good, but you can still model how many of those stems of those things you get at any given site. And if you put it all together and try and predict just how many tree seedlings are out there, all species combined, you see that distance and distance squared weighted density are both good predictors of that. And so the take-home message here is, first of all, that refugia, or patches of live trees, even these little tiny patches way out in the middle of burns, are contributing to forest regeneration. And not surprisingly, that as you move away from these patches, or if you're in landscapes with fewer of these patches, you have less tree regeneration. So that's what the graphs on the bottom left and right are showing. Just on the left, that decrease in abundance of tree seedlings with distance, and on the right, conversely, an increase with our distance squared weight density metric. This is true for ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and some of the other firs, and not really so much with the resprouting and serotinous species. But if you look at just distance, there's a sort of a slight decline with distance as well for those species, which is kind of interesting. And just so you know, the resprouting species there was aspen. We also lumped in there a few alligator junipers, and then as far as the serotinous goes, that was lodgepole pine, which doesn't occur so much in, well, at all in New Mexico or Arizona, except for that one little place that's planted in northern New Mexico. But it is in some of our burns in northern Colorado and also up in Oregon. Okay, and then just to sort of show you this in another way, within this graph on the right shows sort of green being how many tree seedlings or what's their abundance. This is density measured per hectare. So divide by 2.5 if you want to use an acre basis. For ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, and then these resprouters and scrotunus, and then all tree species. I'm just showing distance there. Ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, you can see how much regeneration there is within refugia patches versus outside. And you can see that for those species, at least, there's actually a little bit less inside in the refugium than outside. So, fire can stimulate the regeneration of those species. But as you move away from your seed sources, those things drop off pretty quick. So take-home message here, refugia are really good at promoting forest recovery, and that's what the photo shows. This is kind of a common sight from the field. If you find, when you go up to sample these patches of surviving trees, they'd often have sort of a ring of tree seedlings around them, which would disappear as you got away from those things. So probably nothing too unusual there. Our next question, though, we moved into sort of a simulation modeling approach because we were interested in sort of asking, well, what patch sizes and abundances of refugia patches are actually the best at promoting forest recovery? So would it be small patches if you had a lot of small patches? Would it be a couple of really large patches or something in between? And those pictures are just illustrating what some of some of these patches look like in the field. Also, if you look at the bottom part of that slide, these are just graphics from our simulation model where we sort of created simulated landscapes of what refugia patches could, in theory, look like. So, okay, and try not to dig too deep into the methods of this modeling. But basically, we use those statistical models that we already developed, and we generated simulated landscapes of refugia patches. Then we took those simulated landscapes and we calculated the metrics that predicted tree seedling abundance in our statistical models of field data. So for our simulated landscapes, for any given point on those landscapes, we could say, well, what's the distance and what's our weighted density metric for any given non-forested pixel. And then you put that into a simulation, and basically the simulation puts tree seedlings on the ground as a function of those metrics based on how it worked in the field. And then we can start to experiment with different configurations and numbers and densities and sizes of these patches. So, okay, this is what the simulation model revealed. And just to sort of explain, I got to move this thing off of my screen here. Okay, so basically to explain how these graphics work, if first of all, we're looking at these different groups of species. Ponderosa pine, this is our obligate-seeding is our Doug fir and true firs. They just got kind of lumped together just because we didn't have enough of every species to model each one individually. Okay, so year 1, year 5, year 10, year 20, and then proportion of the landscape that was non-forested that had tree seedlings on it. Okay, so that's what each of these graphs will show. And then what the lower bottom axis shows is what was our initial proportion of that landscape that had patches of refugia on it. So if you don't look at the different colors of the lines yet, you can see that across that ponderosa pine panel, as you have more proportion of the landscape forested, you have more proportion recovered, which makes sense. Okay, you can also see that recovery proceeds over time with very little in the first year and then more recovery in each subsequent year. And then what I think is the important part here is how that varies by patch size. So if all of your patches are small, that's the dark gray line, you see that recovery happens much more quickly, or you have a greater proportion of the landscape with tree seedlings on it than if all of your patches are these lighter colors up to these larger. This is a 1,000 hectare patch. So if you have, for any given proportion of the landscape that's covered in refugia, it's better if your patches are small than if they're large. And that was also the case in our obligate seeding mixed conifer model. So it's true for Doug fir, ponderosa, any of these species that have to have a live tree seed source nearby in order for trees to get established following fire. The more refugia you have, the better. And if your refugia are small, they are disproportionately more important than if they're large. Okay, and when we looked at our other assemblage of resprouting and serotinous species, you could essentially, that's aspen and lodgepole pine. Basically, there's not really much, there's really, well, no relationship to refugia. These were species that don't necessarily need to have live tree seed sources, and that's confirmed by the simulation model. It's good when your models show you something that's obvious, because then hopefully there are the things that weren't obvious, you can have some confidence that those things are valid too. Okay, and then finally the bottom panel, all tree species. When you put it all together, you can see the same pattern. You have more recovery, and it's a function of how much proportion of the landscape has forest on it, and small patches are disproportionately more important than large patches. And I just want to point out the caveat that these models, we didn't incorporate climate variables into these models. So this is sort of based on the mean climate conditions across all the burns that we studied. And when we actually look at some of the individual burns, there's actually, some of them are loaded with regeneration. So a lot of the burns up in the Northwest and Oregon had lots of tree seedlings. In the Southwest, the story's a little different. Some of our burns had a lot, and some of our burns had very few. And that, you know, beyond just whether or not patches were near refugia. So the drier and warmer sites, like the Cerro Grande burn, parts of the Rodeo Chetaskai, there's very little going on there in terms of regeneration. The more mesic sites, parts of some of the burns on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, they're loaded with tree seedlings. And so this is just sort of a mean, when you don't really think about climate, how do these landscapes work? But if we start to put climate in there, we can probably see that some of these patterns are going to be overridden by effects of climate in terms of reducing these rates quite a bit. Okay, this is a little bit theoretical or conceptual, but maybe we could think about refugia as being this interesting phenomenon that actually link ecological resistance with resilience. So we have a little patch that somehow escaped fire, that had some inherent fire resistance, and that sort of contributes to the resilience of the landscape. So patch scale disturbance resistance leading to a landscape scale resilience, and we can illustrate this with one of these ball and cup diagrams. I lost my cursor, there it is. So, you know, this is kind of a classic, I'll look at the one in the middle here, a classic ball and cup diagram, right? On the right side would be a non-forested outcome, on the left side would be a forest recovery. What can we do to, if we're interested in having forests recover, what can we do to tip this system so that the ball is more likely to go back in the forest cup than the non-forest cup? And maybe I'm just going to go from right to left here, as we get closer and closer to refugia, where we have more of them out on the landscape, well, we have more likelihood that we can have the return to that forested condition. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about management implications here, or maybe spend maybe the next 10 minutes talking about this. This might be a chance too for folks to chime in or ask questions. We can think about how does this actually relate to what land managers can do. Here are some ideas, but I'm happy to discuss or think about other things. So pre-fire, maybe we can think about how fuel treatments might promote refugia formation during a wildfire. So instead of sort of, just thinking about how we configure fuel treatments, maybe there are ways to think about fuel treatments that might optimize chances that we have lots of small patches of forest following a wildfire event. We can also think about management during fire. So during incident management, how can we maybe maintain more of these patches of surviving forest on the landscape, or at least not, remove them? And I'm specifically thinking about burnout operations, where we might want to retain patches of forest, and how a burnout operation could inadvertently remove some of these important legacies. Also, we know that during fire, if we have fires burning under low and moderate fire weather, they're more likely to interact with topography and lead to refugia formation. And this is a paper that Ed Krawczyk led up a few years ago, and the graphics illustrate a simulated refugia patchiness under benign, moderate, and extreme fire weather conditions. And this is just to sort of reiterate the point that we're going to have fire, and we can we can allow some fires to burn under conditions that might lead to a better outcome than if we suppress fires under those conditions and then sort of get stuck with the fires burning under conditions when there's no chance of any sort of suppression. And then thinking about post-fire management, I'm trying to make the case that these little surviving patches of trees are just super important, and we have good results that show they contribute to forest recovery versus tree regeneration. So how can we maintain those patches? Some of the burns we visited, there's great forest recovery, but that also means that these patches are now they're loaded with ladder fuels. Those right inside those patches might be good places, or right around those patches might be good places to have a second entry or a fuel reduction to maintain those patches, maintain those seed sources. We can also think about following fire, how we have limited resources for replanting. How can we maybe use understanding our refugia to focus where we replant? Certainly, the farther you get away from these patches, those are the places that are replanting is most likely to be the most valuable for forest recovery, right? Also, I'm sort of suggesting that maybe we could plant trees in groups in little patches that actually sort of mimic refugia, and just to steal a phrase that I got from Malcolm North, versus sort of pines and lines. So thinking about planting in ways that might lead to sort of the same outcome, and this patchiness that we think could then promote subsequent forest recovery. So I have a couple that are just examples of refugia concept applied, and then we'll have some time for some questions if there are any. But this is some work that Ed Krawczyk and Garrett Meigs are doing up in the Pacific Northwest. But can we predict where refugia occur, particularly where can we use topographic features or other ways of understanding landscapes to predict where fire is less likely to remove forests? This turns out to be super important for all sorts of species that are dependent on mature and old growth forests. Of course, the northern spotted owl sort of being the poster child for that. So what locations will support refugia even under projected changes in fire danger associated with changing climate? And then where is sort of the greatest potential for long-term late successional forest sustainability? So these are the kinds of questions we can ask, again, using that refugia lens to think about landscapes. Here's a paper that we have currently in press, led up by Will Downing, but how will these refugia support different plant communities or species? And basically we're finding that the actual numbers of plant species is basically the same between an any given site, inside or outside of refugia, but that there are a lot more species that we're only seeing in refugia than we would expect by chance. So they may have some role in maintaining particular plant species that don't do well in high severity burn interiors. And then lastly, we're also exploring maybe how broadly can we take this refugium concept and think about forest disturbances. So fires is what we've been talking about today, but maybe we can think about refugia for drought and for insects. And there's a great paper by Alison Cartwright in Forests, I think it was maybe last year, exploring those two. But how much utility does the concept have sort of broadly across disturbances, and certainly, again, also as well across forest landscapes and thinking about future climate. Okay, so conclusions. Fire refugia are areas that are relatively unaffected by fire. Small refugia may be overlooked when we rely on our kind of classic 30-meter resolution maps of burn severity. Fire refugia, especially small patches, contribute importantly to post-fire forest regeneration. And understanding why and where refugia may occur could inform management. And also management may be useful in promoting the occurrence or maintenance of refugia. And just to go back, I hope I've convinced you, or at least provided some evidence in support of the idea that even this one tree that's left in the middle, I think this is again the pumpkin burn, is a super important tree, and anything we can do to maintain that tree and let it do its thing out there is probably a good thing if we want forests to recover in this landscape. So just real quick, lots of acknowledgements for funding. Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Station, Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, and agreements with them, or Western Oregon State, great help in the field from some of our awesome undergrads, and here are those references I mentioned. So if you want to look those up later, there they are. And with that, I don't know if there's time. Hopefully there's a little bit of time, and hopefully there's some questions, more importantly. And I'll turn it back over to, I don't know, Xander, however you want to run this. And I don't know, maybe
I like the photo, but I want to review some of those citations. So can you go back one slide?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, good. I hadn't seen that Ryan Walker's new paper in Forest, so make sure I note that down. Well, thank you. I think you did an amazing job of both conveying some pretty intense statistics and analysis methods while staying focused on the overarching point. So I was able to follow along, which means that I'm sure everybody else was as well. Let's see, we have one question that's come in so far. It looks like there's some more maybe. So Andy Stevenson is asking, you've revisited the pumpkin fire since it was reburned in the boundary fire. And then he mentions that the kaibab did plant in groups to sort of mimic these refugia. However, most of those groups suffered high mortality, and it's kind of back to square one outside of those groups. So I don't know, Jonathan, have you been back to pumpkins since the boundary fire?
No, I haven't, but I would really like to get back there, and that's just it's on my list of things to do, I guess. But it'd certainly be interesting to see how well some of I think the question I would be interested in as well would be how well those refugia patches of surviving trees, whether they persisted through or whether they were lost. And that, I think, would be another good follow-up. And in the Jemez, of course, we saw that the Las Conchas fire, when it reburned the Cerro Grande, La Mesa, Dome, I mean, there were patches of trees that we would have called refugia that didn't make it through the second fire. And so sort of the effects of these repeated or compounding disturbances on refugia, I think, is an interesting and important question to be thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sean just asked, how would a low budget and technologically minimal on the ground fuel thinning treatment ID identify potential refugia? So thinking about operationalizing this, if telling a hand crew who's going out to work or something, we have guidance for old and large trees and that sort of thing. Do you think you could put together a couple of bullets that would help them spot out these refugia?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and we've spent a lot of time trying to model using all sorts of topographic predictors where refugia occur, and the answer is it's really hard to model that. And so I think, honestly, it's the kind of thing that probably people on the ground are going to have a much better idea about, especially, you know, people who've looked at forest patterns following fire, and, you know, been on fires, you know. So I think we can think about places on the landscape that naturally might have a lower probability of burning. So places where there are sort of field breaks that might be associated with, you know, a canyon wall or a rock outcrop, or you know, the edge of a meadow or something like that. So maybe if we can go to those places, we could say, hey, we have, if the fire's moving, you know, from left to right or east to west across this landscape, you know, we have a place where the fire behavior is likely to change. And that might be a place to say, okay, well, what if we go in and do some thinning, you know, on the back side of that? We might have a chance at keeping this patch of forest if the fire is, you know, moving from right to left or west to east in my imagination right now. Hopefully you're following. But I also think, so we can think about places where we might expect fire behavior to change based on what we see on the ground now. But also, you know, as I said, we've had a really hard time trying to model this stuff. And that's also because fire has just innate, just randomness to it, right? And so that's where I think we can think about, you know, sort of creating structures on the ground that are likely to influence fire behavior that might also lead to sort of this patchiness. So I guess I'm being a little bit vague here, but you know, thinking about how fuel treatments get configured such that when a fire comes through, it's likely to you know, have multiple places where its behavior changes, where it drops back onto the ground, or you know. So I think a lot of fuel treatments are done. I guess here'd be an analogy. We might think about the a group of homes in the wildland urban interface, and how would we put a fuel treatment around those homes to try and, you know, protect those particular, you know, values at risk? Well, we put a fuel treatment around the whole cluster of homes, right, around that whole neighborhood. We could think about when we're going into forested landscapes, maybe we have a fuel treatment around a particular area where there's some older trees or larger, more mature trees, so they have that spacing, and say, okay, this might be a place where we can put a fuel treatment in sort of a, you know, like a donut shaped fuel treatment that might help protect, you know, a certain patch when that fire comes through, instead of maybe going in there and saying, okay, we're gonna, you know, clear this, you know, large square, we're gonna have a fuel treatment that's in a square shape. It might be more of, you know, it might be more of a patchy shape that had sort of patches that were, you know, where the idea was, okay, this could promote refugia formation. I'm being a little bit vague here because it's something that I think is worth exploring, but you know, it's sort of an idea that I just have that perhaps, yeah, isn't it? I don't have any data on how to do this, and that's how I'm a scientist, so I'm stuck thinking that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting direction to think, though, and I wonder, you know, you have a pretty unique set of maps, and I thought it was pretty convincing that the MTBS, yes, it's great for kind of a national perspective, but for refugia, it doesn't seem like it's capturing some really important small patches. So I wonder if somebody within your team would be interested in taking previous fuel treatment maps, like, you know, I know for, say, Rodeo Chetasky or something, I've seen maps where they line up past fuel treatments with severity, and I wonder if there's some interesting work yet to be done around matching fuel treatments or entries or past fires in the perimeters that you've already mapped out as forest, non-forest, sort of look at some of those implications.
Yeah, that's great, Xander. I think, you know, and we've done this kind of study too, where we've looked at how, you know, fuel treatments and, you know, prescribed fire how that changed subsequent fire behavior. And the take-home message generally is that those things are effective at keeping trees on the landscape when you have your wildfire roll through later on. But the actual pattern of those treatments and the resulting pattern of tree or post-fire refugia, I think that would be a really interesting question to maybe explore in a little depth. So hopefully, if maybe JFSP gets some funding for research in the future, we could start to delve into that sort of stuff. But that's great thinking.
Any other questions? Feel free to type them in the chat window. I know Doug Cram's sitting in his office with a hot question, or Gitterman's on the line too. I'm sure he's got something for us. While we're waiting for them, I'll also highlight that the Southwest Fire Science Consortium helps sponsor a field trip to the pumpkin fire. And we're actually still sort of waiting on a little write-up of that field trip and some of the discussion, but we'll share that around, because I think that's an interesting example of some of this refugia thinking and even planting and recovery and subsequent fire. The other thing I'll highlight is that in the spring, I think actually in preparation for that same field trip, Bert gave a nice webinar that I can share the link to on his planting work, and certainly from the reforestation side that Owen really is coming from. He definitely takes this mimicking refugia very seriously, and I think there's a link in there between looking at sort of what ends up naturally and what we might try to put in afterwards in planting. So there's a nice connection in this research. And not seeing other questions come in, maybe, good, okay. Chris came through. Lots of great work, Jonathan. Do you think the refugia have the capability of slowing resprouting species like oak from outcompeting the pine or Douglas fir seedlings? So in other words, could they slow type conversion if we think about oak taking over sites? Or, obviously Chris has done some work on oak patch and persistence on the landscape. So I think that's sort of where his question's coming from.
Yeah. Well, hey, Chris, that's a good question, and I guess I'll answer that in maybe two ways. One is, I think my sense is I think there's still a lot of work we can do to really understand the how much competitive interaction there is between oak patches or robinia or whatever it is and tree seedlings. And I think the important question there is going to be the sort of how strong those competitive interactions are as a function of the individuals. So my sense would be that it's if you have forest recovery maybe early on post-fire before the oaks start to get really large, and they definitely grow fast, but maybe there's a window in there where the competition is less intense. And then once those oaks and once they really fill in that landscape, I would imagine that the competition is more intense. And this is just me speculating that. And then probably it takes a long time before the oaks are sort of start to fall apart a little bit and get older, that maybe you have more of a window for trees to get reestablished. I don't know. I would speculate that there is an opportunity early on post-fire when tree seedling regeneration is probably more likely to be successful in the face of a bunch of competitors that are growing, and that the longer that patch sits there without any tree seedlings, the more difficult of an environment it is for the seedlings to get established. But that's just me speculating, and I really don't know. So I would say, given that, I think that the more patches of refugia you have and the more tree seed sources you have out there, the more likely you are to have forest recovery in spite of those competitive interactions. But again, these are great research questions again.
Yeah, and I would imagine complicated by sort of weather, interannual variations in weather, and whether or not those seedlings, sort of refugia generated seedlings, could get established quickly. You know, you might just hit a wet year and they do great, or you might hit a dry year and they do poorly. So they're probably a tough one to tease out very well. Well, we've gone past our hour, so we should probably wrap up. Jonathan, I really want to thank you again. It was a great presentation. I think this is a fascinating area of research, so I really appreciate you sharing it. It's so much more, I get so much more out of it than just reading the paper. So I appreciate that. And thanks for calling in all the way from Spain. I hope you continue to have a great time. And we'll look forward to seeing you back in the Southwest when you return.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks, Andrew. And thanks for hosting. And also just really thanks to all you guys at the Southwest Fire Science Consortium for, providing these opportunities for scientists and land managers to, exchange. I think it's incredibly valuable. It's only more and more valuable every year, so thanks.
Well, thank you. Okay. I'm going to end the meeting, and thanks everybody for joining.